All right, our paper focuses on seed dispersal by bats and birds in forest and disturbed habitats of Chiapas, Mexico. A little background, this paper was analyzing the Selva Lacandona, Chiapas, which is located in Mexico and it borders Guatemala. Seed dispersal there is crucial because it is estimated that between 50 to 90% of plants in this area depend on pollinators. This paper focused on two pollinators, which are birds or bats. Both of them cover a large area, and the size of their population is about the same. And there were four sections of interest in the experiment, which looked at disturbance gradients, but we would focus more on them a little later down. Next. So the objective of this paper was to analyze if bats and birds represent a different dispersal group. We know that they pollinate at different times, with birds pollinating in the morning and bats pollinating at night. However, seeing how they pollinate combined has never been studied. And they also wanted to look at species contribution to successional stages and seed shadows. Next.
Experiment, circular seed traps were placed at 10 randomly chosen points in the 4 different habitats which were tested. The 4 habitats were the primary forest, a cacao plantation, an abandoned cornfield, and an active cornfield. The traps were all placed near a trail in each of these habitats. These traps were examined twice a day, once before sunset at 1800 hours and the other time before sunrise at 0400 hours. And this was done for 10 days in each of the 12 months examined. We assume that the seeds collected at 1800 hours were dispersed by the birds, and that the seeds that were collected at 0400 hours were dispersed by the bats. When comparing the seed dispersal by the bats and the birds between the habitats and months, the generalized linear model analysis of deviance was used. Lastly, chi-squared tests were used to analyze the species richness of seeds per functional group and per habitat. These graphs display the findings. And just by taking a quick glance at the graphs, we can clearly see how there was much more seeds dispersed by the bats as compared by the birds if we look at the top 2 graphs compared to the bottom 2 graphs. But more specifically, 79% of the seeds were dispersed by the bats and 20% of the total seeds were dispersed by the birds. If we compare the habitats, which are the 2 graphs to the left, we can see that the old field habitat showed the greatest dispersal by bats with an average of 3.21 seeds per night, whereas the greatest dispersal by birds was shown in the forest with 0.65 seeds, with an average of 0.65 seeds dispersed per day. The cornfield was clearly the habitat with the smallest amount of seed dispersal from both groups, with 0.3 seeds dispersed by the bats and 0.09 seeds dispersed per day by the birds. If we look at the dispersal rates by month, which are the graphs on the right, there's a few things to highlight. There were no seeds found in December, neither in the day nor in the night, for both the birds and the bats. Also, bats dispersed the greatest amount of seeds in August, while the birds dispersed the greatest amount of seeds in July. It's also important to note that for both the bats and the birds, from December to May is when the smallest amount of seeds were dispersed, with the months in the corners of the graphs, September, October, November, and June, July, and August being the months with the most seed dispersal in both the bats and the birds. Or as we previously stated, the bats dispersed significantly more seeds than the birds. The greatest difference between the two came, however, in the intermediate stages of disturbance, which were the abandoned cornfield and the cacao plantation, where 2 to 7 times more seeds were dispersed by the bats compared to the birds. Overall, the number of species dispersed by the bats was greater in each habitat than dispersed by the birds. A high percentage of the seeds dispersed were Cecropia seeds in all the habitats except for the cornfield, which had a relatively low amount of Cecropia seeds. This is most likely due to the relatively high abundance of another vertebrate dispersed pioneer in that habitat, Physalis campandata, which accounted for the majority of the seeds dispersed by both bats and birds.
In conclusion, this was the first study to simultaneously analyze the importance of both groups of pollinators. Dispersed across disturbance gradients was higher in bats, as mentioned before, which makes them a very important player in conservation efforts. This is significant because regardless of the gradient, bats can be a great source in order to help improve the overall ecosystem. An area of further research in the paper was the success of seed germination across all gradients. These are our sources.